Episode 24, The Pursuer and the Pursued, Part 2. Hello to all listeners, and thank you for joining us for another episode in our series dedicated to the great heroes described in the book of Samuel. We always say with amazement that the book's author had a rare ability to understand and describe the human psyche. Although he didn't use psychological terms, he portrayed a rich gallery of characters with remarkable skill. These characters had complex traits and acted with emotional intensity, such as explosive anger, profound love, and consuming hatred. He characterized each figure with precision, making his book a powerful and touching psychological drama that allows us to identify something deeply authentic about humanity and ourselves. Such an experience would not have been possible had he portrayed the characters as flawless superheroes like Superman or Batman, devoid of human weaknesses. In the previous episode, we discussed the pivotal moment when the tribal elders came to Samuel's house and informed him that his two sons were corrupt and therefore could not inherit his position. Moreover, during that meeting, they requested that he establish a warrior king in Israel who would lead the army in battle against the Philistines. Samuel ignored the criticism expressed by the elders about his sons, claiming their demand was a crime and rebellion against God. Still, since God instructed him to comply with the elders, he had no choice but to do as commanded, as detailed in chapter 8. The book's author didn't explicitly state that Samuel was deeply hurt by the elders who had prevented him from passing his role to his sons and establishing a priestly dynasty that would bear his name. However, from that day forward, every story portrays him as a man driven by deep resentment and vengeful motives. From a theological perspective, God chose Saul to be the first king of Israel, yet in practical reality, he wasn't the kind of king the elders had requested. Saul, despite his impressive height, was a young man lacking any military experience, and worse, he suffered from an extreme lack of self-confidence. Samuel, who immediately recognized Saul's insecurities, repeatedly placed him in situations designed to embarrass and humiliate him. Instead of conducting a single festive and dignified coronation, Samuel crowned Saul in 3 successive ceremonies. Each coronation was more traumatic and humiliating than the previous one. In each coronation, Samuel demonstrated to the tribal elders and the people of Israel that their desire to transition to a monarchical system was a crime against God, as told in chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. At the end of the 3rd coronation, described in chapter 12, Samuel asked God to pour torrential rain on the freshly harvested wheat. The unexpected rain destroyed the wheat, a disaster that symbolized divine disapproval, as wet wheat rots and grows mold. The crowd gathered for the coronation ceremony was terrified by Samuel's harsh words, and by the fact that as divine punishment for demanding a king, he prayed for God to destroy the wheat from which they made bread, the basic food of the ancient world. With no other choice, they acknowledged Samuel's judgment. Samuel concluded this coronation with these words, "Do not be afraid," Samuel replied. "You have done all this evil. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you, and I will teach you the way that is good and right." Saul, who was present at the event, bowed his head in silence. Samuel did not keep his promise and abandoned his people. Until his death, he never forgave the tribal elders for preventing his sons from inheriting his position and role and compelling him to appoint a king. His actions show that until the end of his days, he worked to undermine the king's authority and humiliate him in public. Having said these things, let us proceed and prove them. The Bible maintains silence about Saul's first years of reign. We can reasonably infer that the tribal elder and his family members helped him in his early years and guided him in understanding his royal responsibilities. In the next encounter with Saul, he appears as an experienced king who has established an army and led campaigns against the Philistines, Israel's persistent nemesis. Chapter 13 suggests his initial success in consolidating power. Quote, Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him, and 1,000 were with Jonathan. Chapter 14 says the following, After Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side, Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered them. Despite these accounts of his growing strength, the idea that Saul gained self-confidence over time is contradicted by his continued fear of Samuel, which only grew stronger. Chapter 13 describes a severe confrontation at Gilgal, where Saul's army prepared to fight the Philistines who were threatening an Israeli settlement near present-day Jerusalem. While the Philistines continued their preparations without interruption, Samuel inexplicably commanded Saul to wait 7 days for his arrival to perform a religious ceremony and bless the warriors before they went to battle. Conducting a religious ceremony before a military campaign was a widespread ancient tradition. The ceremony was designed to boost warrior morale by ensuring divine favor, thus alleviating pre-battle anxiety and giving them confidence that their God would stand by their side. Samuel, merely half a day's journey by donkey from Saul's position, gave no explanation for his 7-day delay or his absence after that time passed. The psychological impact of this delay was devastating. When the warriors saw that Samuel had not arrived to perform the ritual and bless them, they were seized with fear and a sense of immediate danger. Acting on survival instinct, many of them deserted Saul and fled to distant places, while others hid in caves and pits. When Saul saw that his warriors were scattering, he acted as expected of a commander and performed the religious ceremony himself, restoring confidence to the warriors who remained with him. Predictably, Samuel arrived immediately after the ceremony ended. Let's briefly read a short quote from chapter 13 that describes their meeting. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come, and Saul's men began to scatter. "So," he said, "bring me the burnt offering," and Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. Rather than apologizing for being late, Samuel attacked Saul and said, "What have you done?" Saul, who tended to undervalue himself, justified his actions, saying, "When I saw that the men were scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." Though Saul's response reflected sound military leadership, it provoked Samuel's fury. Before the assembled warriors, he proclaimed, "You have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command." The stunned Saul, who until then had behaved with authority as both king and commander, instantly lost his confidence. He hastened to apologize, attempting to justify himself. Samuel, of course, was not convinced. Yet from a theological perspective, Saul's victory in this battle indicates that he had not sinned against God. Now let's turn to chapter 15 and their next encounter, which was much worse than the one we just discussed. Chapter 15 talks about the war with Amalek, and here's the story briefly. Samuel announced to Saul that God had commanded him to take revenge on the Amalekites. About 200 years earlier, when the Israelites left Egypt, the Amalekites had pursued them, as recorded in Exodus 17. Deuteronomy 25 references this event and commands the Israelites to destroy them in the future. Quote, "Remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on your journey and attacked all who were lagging behind. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all the enemies around you in the land he is giving you to possess, you shall blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget." Now the future had become present, and the hour of revenge had arrived. God told Samuel that Saul must go and destroy the Amalekites, including all their animals and all their possessions. This command seemed strategically questionable. The Amalekites were a small, distant tribe posing no threat at all, while the Philistines raided Israeli settlements time and again, threatening their territorial. Essentially, Saul was ordered to abandon an urgent military campaign and travel roughly 180 miles southward toward Egypt to settle an ancient score offering no tactical or military advantage. Saul obeyed Samuel's order and led his army to strike Amalek. But contrary to the command he received, he spared the life of Agag, king of Amalek, as well as their sheep and cattle. From a theological point of view, Saul sinned and angered God, who regretted choosing him as king. According to the story, Samuel too truly mourned the king's failure. The next day, the meeting between the two took place, and the Bible provides the details of their long and emotional conversation that, of course, took place in the presence of Saul's warriors. When they met, Saul said that he had carried out the Lord's command, but when Samuel asked about the sound of sheep and cattle he heard, Saul explained that his warriors had spared the animals to sacrifice them to the Lord. All the anger that Samuel had accumulated since the day the elders visited his house erupted, and his harsh and offensive words surpassed any outburst he had ever shown. Quote, "Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord?" And Samuel added, "Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." Saul's mental state crumbled in an instant. He could not imagine that he had sinned against God, and shocked by the accusations hurled at him, and instantly lost what little confidence he had managed to build. As he did when he was young, he immediately admitted his guilt, and much worse, he admitted that he, the king, was afraid of his soldiers. Quote, "Then Saul said to Samuel, 'I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them.'" Overwhelmed by anxiety and a desperate need for Samuel's validation and forgiveness, he humbled himself before his soldiers and pleaded, "Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me, so that I may worship the Lord. I have sinned, but please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me, so that I may worship the Lord your God." Samuel took advantage of the king's vulnerable state and responded cruelly, "You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel." And to amplify the impact of the injury of the defeated king, he added, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you." This encounter had severe consequences for Saul's mental state, which we will discuss in the following episodes. The meeting ended with Samuel returning to his home, and until the end of his days, he never saw Saul again, never blessed the warriors who continued to fight the Philistines, and never fulfilled his duty as the religious leader of Israel. Let's briefly summarize what we said in this episode, the final one dedicated to Samuel's story. It was a conscious choice of the author to highlight the psychological state of the heroes against the backdrop of the historical changes that took place in Israeli society from the day the tribal elders came to Samuel's house and asked him to appoint a warrior king. Alongside this request, the elders informed Samuel that since his two sons were corrupt, they would not inherit his position. The practical meaning of their announcement was that Samuel would not be able to establish a priestly dynasty that would bear his name. From that day on, Samuel is described as an angry and vengeful man. As a revenge, he appointed an insecure and anxious young man to be a king, whom he could degrade time and time again. Let us recall the 3 traumatic coronation ceremonies he conducted for Saul, the intentional delay in coming to bless the soldiers before battle, which caused them to flee in fear, and how each encounter with Saul was accompanied by harsh criticism intended to undermine his authority in the eyes of his people. The author masterfully portrayed Saul's character in stark contrast to Samuel. Though physically tall, Saul was mentally fragile, completely unable to cope with Samuel's scathing words. He constantly apologized and sought forgiveness and recognition from the very person who repeatedly undermined his authority and eroded his mental stability. One can observe how the toxic relationship between the two figures deteriorates from one encounter to the next, reaching its climax on the eve of Saul's final battle with the Philistines, as described in chapter 28. That night, the tormented Saul sought out the Witch of Endor to summon Samuel's spirit, hoping to learn his fate in the upcoming battle. Though he desperately needed words of encouragement, Samuel's spirit showed no mercy. Instead, it assailed the king with harsh reproach, bringing him to his knees and leaving him utterly defeated and helpless. Before concluding, let us offer one final example that interweaves the Bible's theological dimension with the author's meticulous attention to the psychological complexity of his characters. Chapter 16 reveals how God directed Samuel to a small village called Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse. There, Samuel was to anoint one of Jesse's 8 sons as the next king. Among them, the youngest, a ruddy youth with beautiful eyes, was David. Once again, Samuel repeated what he had done years before with Saul. In one unexpected moment and without prior preparation, he abruptly anointed David as king. One might question why Samuel, for the second time, chose an inexperienced young man to rule over Israel, a matter we shall explore further. Yet here lies the dramatic twist in the plot. David proved to be a natural-born leader. In stark contrast to Saul, whose panic attacks would progressively intensify during the coming years, until he lost all grip on reality, David had remarkable psychological resilience, strategic brilliance, and boundless charisma. This time, Samuel had chosen a king he could not intimidate. Before we say goodbye, we need your support to produce more episodes. Our podcast requires expertise in various fields, including extensive historical knowledge, familiarity with ancient Israeli legal and social practices, and proficiency in biblical Hebrew. Your support helps us continue bringing these fascinating biblical insights to life. Those willing to support this unique project can visit our website, designed by Omer Bender, and contribute through the Patreon page or by buying us a cup of coffee. Those interested in purchasing Dr. Ravid's book, Daily Life in Biblical Times, can do so through our podcast's website. The book examines the actions of biblical heroes considering the social and legal norms that obligated them to act in that way and not in another way. Ravid's book contains translations of numerous puns and wordplays that are lost in the English translation, giving you unique insights into the original meaning of these timeless stories. In the next episode, we'll meet Jonathan, Saul's firstborn son, who was the natural candidate to succeed his father and become the second king of Israel. We'll see once again how the author wove historical reality as a backdrop to portray Saul's deteriorating mental state. Once again, we'll witness the brilliance of the author who left us with a remarkable historical and psychological drama. Thank you for tuning in to our program. Please tell your family and friends about our podcast.